if you have some justifiable moral outrage, let's say something really annoys you, or I shouldn't say that, deeply violates your sense of moral propriety, I don't mean trivial things, then the fact of that forceful response can motivate you to do things, well, it does for me for lecture, but certainly to write. It takes a lot of energy to write, man. You need all those sources of energy if you're going to be able to do it. Just and even to turn it on yourself, to discipline yourself, It's like I had to grab myself by the scruff of the neck when I was a young guy to sit down, God damn it, and write. And there's a force that's necessary, to, especially if you're open, because you're all over the place, if you're creative, to get yourself to sit down and focus. Yes, that's right. Yeah. And, some of that anger, I think Jung talks about this, is that dark side contains a lot of energy. It contains a lot of power. Those 2-year-olds that are kicking and screaming, that's all this kind of force behind it. And when you sort of are ashamed of it and you push that down, you're kind of getting rid of an incredible well of energy that you can use for your creativity, for your work, etc. You can take that energy, like you say, and create discipline out of it, do something creative out of it, support some cause that you really believe in, So that shadow side, when you deny it, only negative things will happen. And it is extremely important for people to first recognize it in themselves, and it's very hard for a lot of people to do that. Well, I found, like I said earlier, that one of the best ways in there is resentment. You watch yourself because if you're resentful, you're feeling like you're being victimized and mistreated. It's like, okay, well, maybe you are. Okay, and you think there's no anger in that resentment, so you're not looking hard enough. If you watch your fantasies, for example, if you're resentful and you watch the fantasies that flit through your imagination, like you might not want to attend to them because they can be so brutal. Right. But because if someone is oppressing you genuinely and you're not standing up for yourself, then there'll be these compensatory fantasies. Yeah. So one day I'll tell you a story about that. So one day I'd been renovating my house and it took a long time. And the neighbors, this house was a complete derelict and it was a semi-detached, like really a derelict. It hadn't been touched since like 1927. It had gas fittings in the upper floor. It needed to be completely gutted. And so we gutted it. And my daughter got sick at exactly the same time, really sick. And so it was stressful and difficult. And the neighbors they called the city on us. They did everything they could to make it difficult, even though they were attached to us and wanted to sell their house. So we probably added like $25,000 to the value of their house because it was no longer attached to a derelict. And then just as we were finishing, my sister and her husband came to visit, and I was making tea for them, and I closed the cupboard. So it clicked, and the neighbors banged on the wall. And then that night I couldn't sleep, and I had really been pushed to my limit by these people. And I had these visions in my mind of burning the damn place down. And I thought, oh man, if you're starting to think about burning the place down, you should probably go say something. So I put on my parka and I went outside about 6 a.m. and I just waited for them to come out. They never did, but I went and knocked over on the door and I said, I was making tea for my sister last night. And I closed the cupboard. You didn't happen to bang on the wall because you heard my cupboard closing, did you? And they said, yeah. And I said, okay, look, if you bug me anymore, I'm going to cause you so much trouble you cannot possibly imagine it. Yeah. And I meant it. It was like, because I knew what was brewing in the back of my mind. I said, because I was done. It was like, you want a war? You have no idea what you're getting into. And so they backed into the kitchen, and like 2 hours later, they came over and said, oh, we're sorry and we won't do it again. But what we did was the mistake you talk about. We backtracked continually trying to please them. And every time they complained, we did what they wanted because we assumed we were dealing with reasonable people, but we weren't. And the only way to stop them was with a show of force. It was like, you want to be malevolent? You want to play that game? It's like, okay, no problem. But, and things went more smoothly after that. And that's a good example of, paying attention to those fantasies, because I thought I better deal with this straightforwardly. Otherwise, I'm likely to do something stupid. Right.
Right? That's the other
Exactly.
thing you got to watch. If that builds up inside you.
Exactly. Yeah. And a lot of times I look at people in the public eye who get caught doing something really stupid, like you say, and their first thing will be, well, that wasn't me that did it. I don't know what came over me. That's not who I am. But that is exactly who you are. That is the person who has been carrying this resentment and this kind of inner anger, but not acting upon it. And then suddenly they do something really stupid, like having an affair with a 21-year-old, or they just caught doing something.
Yeah. So I watch people with their children a lot, hey?
Yeah.
And so when my son was a pretty assertive kid and tough, like he had a real will. And, when he was 9 months old and starting to crawl around, I taught him what no meant. And what no means is stop doing that, or something you don't like will happen to you. That's what no means.
Right.
And so when he was 9 months, he was starting to take books off shelves and get into the plants and so on, because he was starting to crawl around. And so to teach him what no meant, I just grab his leg when he wasn't doing something that I didn't want him to do. And, he would squawk and bitch and complain, and I'd say, no, no, no. And I'd just hold him until he gave up, and sometimes he would cry. And the reason he was crying is because he was frustrated and angry that I was mucking about with him. It's like, fair enough. He wanted to go explore. And, fair enough, kid, you want to explore. But you can't tear out the plant and get dirt all over the rug. And you can't go into the electrical cords, no.
Right.
And no. And so I had done a lot of behavioral training by that time. And by the time I did that for, say, 6 or 7 days, and soon as if I just said no, he would just stop, and sometimes he would cry. And then the week later, if I said no, he'd just stop. So it took like 2 weeks, eh? And then I knew that if I said no, he would stop. And so then I could let him explore. I could give him a lot of freedom. And then I'd have people come over to my house with their 2-year-old or 3-year-old. And because they had never taught the child what no meant, they never gave, because they didn't want to impose on their freedom, let's say. They couldn't give the child any freedom at all. They had to wander around behind them all the time because they never knew what the child was going to get into. Right. And so then you start to hate your child, right? Because instead of having a bit of free time and just being able to say no to this kid while he's playing around on his own and giving him some freedom, you're just nonstop monitoring this child, and you're mad because you don't have a life. And we had another couple come over, and they had 2 kids that were like 4 and 5, and they were just horrible. We sat down to eat. We wanted to have a conversation, and we put a basket of bread out, and the kids just grabbed the bread and they ate all the centers out of the bread. And the parents were all embarrassed about it, but they didn't do anything to stop it. And, in their minds, they thought, well, aren't we permissive and nice, and we never say no to our children? But they didn't notice that they actually hated their children, because how could you go to someone's house and you want to have a conversation, you just met them, and your children embarrass you to death, and you think you're not going to get resentful about that?
Right.
And you think you're not going to take, and so here's how people would take it out on their kids. So imagine that happens. Now you go home and you're pissed right off, but you're not going to let yourself know that because you're such a nice person. Then your child goes off and draws a picture. Maybe they put a lot of work into it, eh? Then they come running up to show you. And that's a real good time to give them a pat on the head and say, look, isn't that great? But you're pissed off because you were embarrassed. And so you look at it and you think, and that's all you have to do. It's like, that's not really worthy of my attention. You don't have to say anything mean. You just have to not attend in this manner. And then you got your revenge. And you think you won't do that, man. You know nothing about yourself. And you read in the paper sometimes these mothers or fathers, they do something brutal to a child. And I know how that happens. It's like no disciplinary strategies in the house. Yeah. The kid is driving the mother or father crazy. And then maybe the mother or father, they're hungover one day, and maybe they just broke up with their boyfriend or girlfriend, and maybe they got, hell from their boss, who's a tyrant, and they haven't stood up to them. And the kid does the wrong thing at exactly the wrong time. And maybe he's actually pretty good at that by then. And it's like, out comes Satan himself. Yeah. And all hell breaks loose. It's like, I wouldn't do that. It's like, there's almost nothing you wouldn't do. You just don't know yourself very well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, the ability to set limits and to say no and to tell people that, it's not right for you to bang on my house at this hour, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That takes a little bit of toughness on your part. You have to be kind of willing to put yourself on the line. Maybe that person will get angry and hit you or something, or maybe the war will escalate, but you have to be willing to take that risk. because if you don't, then you set no limits, and who knows what they'll end up doing. But a lot of this permissiveness is people are just basically afraid. They're afraid of any kind of confrontation.
Yeah.
They're afraid of any kind of conflict. And through conflict and confrontation is how you actually grow. It's actually how you develop as a person.
Hey, so here's a cool stat. This is really interesting, man. So there's been some great work on what behavioral markers predict divorce in couples counseling. Really solid work. Okay, so here's one predictor. When the couple is talking in front of a therapist and one of them or the other or both roll their eyes, there's like a 95% chance they're going to be divorced within 6 months. And that's contempt. They've become so disconnected because they don't communicate, because the resentment has built up that they now have contempt for each other.